Trade Inspector Samuel Cross had conducted routine labor compliance inspections on 47 different stations throughout the Outer Rim territories, and he'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when routine was about to become anything but. The nervous fidgeting of station administrators, the too quick tours that avoided certain sections, the carefully scripted responses to standard questions, all suggested that Nexus Prime was hiding something that wouldn't survive close scrutiny. Inspector Cross, Station Administrator Henley said, guiding him through corridors that seemed designed to confuse rather than facilitate navigation, as you can see, all our commercial operations comply fully with interstellar labor protection standards. Samuel nodded politely while noting that their route had somehow managed to avoid 3 entire levels of the station, despite Henley's claim of conducting a complete tour. His tablet showed several registered businesses operating in sections they hadn't visited, including a logistics company that seemed to employ an unusually large number of workers for its reported revenue. "I'd like to review the employment records for Morlean Enterprises," Samuel said, consulting his inspection checklist. "They're listed as one of your largest employers, but I haven't seen their operations yet." Henley's nervous fidgeting intensified noticeably. "Oh, Morlean's operation is quite specialized. Mostly administrative work that wouldn't be very interesting to inspect. Perhaps we could review their documentation instead of conducting a physical tour." Samuel had been conducting labor inspections long enough to know that administrators only suggested avoiding physical tours when the physical conditions wouldn't pass inspection. Administrator Henley, physical inspection of working conditions is a mandatory component of compliance verification. "I'll need to see Morlean's facilities directly." 20 minutes later, Samuel understood why Henley had been reluctant to include Morlean Enterprises in their tour. The facility was a maze of cramped workspace modules and storage areas that seemed designed to house as many workers as possible in the smallest amount of space. The air recycling was inadequate, the lighting was below standard minimums, and the general atmosphere suggested that worker comfort had been the last consideration in the facility's design. "Most of our workers are contract laborers paying off transportation and training debts," explained Vex Morlean, the Altanian merchant who owned the operation. His smile had the kind of practiced insincerity that Samuel associated with people who made their living exploiting others. "We provide housing, meals, and job training in exchange for their service contracts." Samuel had reviewed hundreds of similar operations, and while most managed to comply with labor protection standards, Morlean's facility felt different, more oppressive, more deliberately designed to maintain control over workers rather than simply employing them. "I'd like to interview some of your workers privately," Samuel said, noting how Morlean's expression tightened at the suggestion. "Of course, though you'll find that most of our workers are quite satisfied with their arrangements. We maintain very professional relationships with our staff." The first few interviews confirmed Samuel's suspicions that something was seriously wrong with Morlean's operation. Workers spoke in the carefully neutral terms of people who had learned that expressing dissatisfaction could lead to extended contracts or reduced privileges. Their responses had the rehearsed quality that suggested coaching on what to say to inspectors. It was during his review of the facility's most remote section that Samuel discovered conditions that made his professional composure crack for the first time in years. In a storage area that had been converted into minimal living space, he found Kira Thane. The young Zephyrian woman was kneeling beside a bowl placed on the floor, her elongated ears drooping with exhaustion and humiliation. Her clothing was simple work coveralls that had seen better months, and her living space consisted of little more than a sleeping mat and basic sanitation facilities. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel cold. They held an intelligence and dignity that remained unbroken despite circumstances that were clearly designed to break her spirit. "Ma'am," Samuel said softly, "I'm Trade Inspector Cross. I'm here to review working conditions. Are you all right?" Kira looked up at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten that people could address her with basic courtesy. Yes, Inspector. I'm fine." Samuel's trained eye quickly assessed her situation and felt his professional objectivity give way to anger. The bowl on the floor contained what appeared to be a nutritionally adequate but deliberately unappetizing mixture that could have been served on plates with utensils like food for sentient beings. Her living space violated several basic standards for worker housing, and her obvious exhaustion suggested work schedules that exceeded legal limits. "Ma'am, how long have you been working for Morlean Enterprises?" 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Kira replied with the precision of someone who had been counting every day of her confinement. "And your working conditions, have they always been like this?" Kira glanced toward the door, as if checking for observers, then looked back at Samuel with an expression that mixed hope with practiced caution. "No, Inspector. They changed after I refused certain requests that weren't part of my original work contract." Samuel felt his stomach drop as he processed the implications. "What kind of requests?" "Personal services," Kira said quietly. "Things that had nothing to do with the logistics work I was contracted to perform." When I said no, Mr. Morlean explained that uncooperative workers receive basic accommodation rather than standard employee privileges. Samuel's anger was building toward levels that threatened his professional composure, but years of inspection work had taught him the value of documentation over emotional response. "Can you describe your original work contract and how your current conditions differ from what was agreed?" Over the next 20 minutes, Kira provided Samuel with a detailed account of systematic degradation that represented everything wrong with current labor protection enforcement. Her family had signed a debt contract to pay for her transportation to the Outer Rim and specialized training in logistics systems. The work had been legitimate initially, utilizing her background in engineering and systems analysis. But when Morlean had begun demanding services that went far beyond professional logistics work, personal attendance, social companionship, and increasingly inappropriate personal services, Kira had refused. Her punishment had been swift and calculated to break her resistance: relegation to the most basic living conditions, denial of proper meals served with dignity, removal of communication privileges, and assignment to menial tasks that didn't utilize her skills or education. "The worst part," Kira said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes, "isn't the food or the living conditions. It's being treated like I'm not a person. Like my thoughts and feelings don't matter because I owe money." Samuel felt something shift inside him as he listened to her story. This wasn't just a labor violation. It was a systematic assault on sentient dignity that exploited legal technicalities to maintain conditions that approached slavery. "Kira," he said, "I want you to know that what's happening to you isn't legal, and it's not something you deserve because of debt obligations. You're being punished for maintaining your dignity and your right to define the terms of your employment." For the first time since he'd entered her makeshift quarters, Kira's expression showed genuine hope. "Inspector, I've tried to contact labor protection agencies, but Mr. Morlean says my contract gives him discretion over my living conditions as long as basic nutritional and shelter needs are met." Samuel pulled out his tablet and began reviewing interstellar labor codes with the kind of focused intensity that had made him effective at finding violations that others missed. "Kira, there are protections built into these laws that Morlean is violating, but they're buried in technicalities that make them hard to enforce. So there's nothing you can do." Samuel looked at this young woman who had maintained her dignity despite systematic efforts to break her spirit, and made a decision that would define both their futures. "There's always something that can be done," he said. "It just might require some creative interpretation of the regulations. But first, I need to understand exactly what skills and knowledge you have that Morlean has been wasting." As Kira began describing her background in engineering systems and her suppressed expertise in logistics optimization, Samuel realized that her situation represented not just an injustice that needed correcting, but an opportunity to prove that treating people with dignity was not only morally right but practically beneficial. "Kira," he said finally, "how would you feel about helping me demonstrate that exploiting people is not only wrong, but also incredibly poor business practice?" Samuel's first attempt to address Kira's situation through official channels taught him why systematic exploitation flourished despite extensive labor protection laws. The regulations were comprehensive and well-intentioned, but they had been written by people who assumed good faith compliance rather than creative circumvention by those who profited from human misery. "Inspector Cross," said Legal Coordinator Martinez through the station's communication system, while the conditions you describe are certainly unfortunate, Mr. Morlian's contracts appear to comply with the technical requirements of current interstellar labor standards. Samuel reviewed the documentation on his tablet, noting how Morlian's operation had been carefully structured to exploit every loophole in the legal framework. Coordinator Martinez, the worker is being forced to eat from bowls on the floor and denied basic dignity. Surely that violates sentient rights provisions. The contracts specify basic nutritional and shelter requirements, which are being met according to your report. The manner of food service, while distasteful, isn't explicitly prohibited by current regulations. And the fact that her working conditions were degraded specifically as punishment for refusing services outside her employment contract. The employer maintains discretion over working conditions as long as minimum standards are met. The worker's testimony about punishment is difficult to verify without documented evidence of the specific requests she refused. Samuel ended the communication feeling frustrated by a system that protected exploiters while offering little recourse for their victims. However, his years of experience with trade regulations had taught him that complex systems always contained opportunities for those clever enough to find them. Over the following days, Samuel conducted what he described as extended compliance documentation that allowed him to spend considerable time at Morlian's facility. His real purpose was working with Kira to understand both her situation and her capabilities in detail sufficient to develop a solution that the legal system couldn't provide. "Tell me about your engineering background," he said during one of their carefully private conversations. "What kind of systems work did you do before your family signed the debt contract?" "Logistics optimization primarily," Kira replied, her voice carrying the enthusiasm that emerged whenever she discussed subjects that engaged her intellect. "I specialized in supply chain management and transportation efficiency analysis. My family needed money for medical expenses, and the transportation costs to the outer rim seemed like a reasonable investment in better employment opportunities." "And Morlian knows about your technical background?" "He did initially. The first few months, I was doing legitimate logistics analysis that saved his operation considerable money through improved efficiency. But when I refused his personal requests, he reassigned me to manual labor that doesn't require my education or skills." Samuel was beginning to understand that Morlian's punishment of Kira wasn't just cruel, it was economically wasteful. By suppressing her capabilities out of spite, he was sacrificing legitimate business advantages for the satisfaction of maintaining control over someone who had defied him. "Kira, what if I told you that Morlian's desire to punish you might be exactly the weakness we need to restore your freedom?" She looked at him with cautious hope. "How?" Samuel had been reviewing Morlian's business operations and financial records, looking for patterns that might create opportunities for intervention. "Your former employer is greedy, vindictive, and not nearly as clever as he thinks he is. Those are vulnerabilities we can exploit if we're careful and creative." Over the next several days, Samuel and Kira developed a plan that would use Morlian's weaknesses against him while operating entirely within legal boundaries. The strategy required convincing Morlian that cooperating with them would generate more profit than continuing to exploit Kira's situation. "The key," Samuel explained, "is making him believe that using your skills properly will make him money, while the legal documentation for that arrangement happens to include clauses that would nullify your debt contracts under specific conditions." "And you think he'll sign agreements without reading them carefully?" "I think he'll sign agreements that promise him profits, especially if they seem to come from my position as a trade inspector with access to lucrative business opportunities." Their plan required Samuel to present Morlian with what appeared to be a legitimate business proposition. Using his contacts throughout the Trade Inspection Service, Samuel had identified a shipment of advanced logistics technology that was available for acquisition by qualified purchasers. The equipment represented genuine value, but evaluating its suitability required technical expertise that Morlian didn't possess. "Mr. Morlian," Samuel said during their carefully arranged meeting, "I've been impressed by the efficiency improvements your operation could achieve with better systems integration. I have access to some advanced logistics technology that might be of interest, but evaluation would require technical expertise." Morlian's expression showed the kind of calculating interest that suggested greed was overcoming caution. "What kind of technology?" Inspector. Automated supply chain management systems, transportation optimization protocols, inventory tracking integration, the kind of equipment that could increase operational efficiency by 30 to 40%. Samuel consulted his tablet with practiced professionalism. But proper evaluation requires someone with significant engineering background in logistics systems. And you're suggesting I might be interested in acquiring this equipment? I'm suggesting that with proper technical evaluation, this equipment could transform your operations' profitability. However, the evaluation process requires someone with extensive logistics engineering experience working directly with the vendor's technical specifications. Samuel watched as Morlean processed the implications, seeing the moment when greed began to outweigh suspicion. Inspector Cross, if I were to provide technical evaluation services for this acquisition, what would be the terms of our arrangement? Standard consulting agreement, Samuel replied, producing documentation he prepared with meticulous attention to legal detail. Your technical specialist would work directly with the vendor to evaluate system compatibility and integration requirements. Compensation would be based on successful acquisition and implementation. The documentation Samuel presented looked like routine consulting contracts, but they contained clauses he'd crafted with the assistance of legal coordinator Martinez, who had been unaware that her legal advice was being used to engineer Kira's freedom rather than simply ensure compliance with regulations. The consulting work would require your technical specialist to have full access to system specifications and vendor communications, Samuel explained as Morlean reviewed the contracts. They'd need to work independently to ensure objective evaluation. And the compensation structure? Performance-based. If the evaluation leads to successful acquisition and the promised efficiency improvements are achieved, the consulting fees would be substantial enough to offset significant operational expenses. Samuel had crafted the compensation clauses to automatically cancel debt obligations if specific performance targets were met, targets that Kira's expertise virtually guaranteed she would achieve. Mr. Morlean, I should mention that this opportunity has a limited time frame. The vendor has other interested parties, so we'd need to begin evaluation immediately. Morlean's signature on the consulting agreement represented victory for their plan, but as Samuel watched him sign away his hold over Kira's future, he realized that their legal success was only the beginning of more complex challenges. Freedom from formal bondage would be meaningless if Kira couldn't rebuild a life after years of systematic dehumanization. The real work of liberation would begin after the paperwork was complete. The trap they had set for Morlean required Kira to demonstrate capabilities she had been forced to suppress for years, a process that proved both liberating and terrifying as she began to remember who she had been before systematic degradation had taught her to make herself small and invisible. The logistics optimization protocols in this system are remarkable, Kira said as she reviewed the technical specifications Samuel had provided, her voice carrying an enthusiasm that made her seem like an entirely different person from the broken woman he had found eating from a bowl on the floor. Integration with existing inventory management would improve efficiency by at least 35%, possibly more with proper calibration. Samuel watched her work with a mixture of admiration and anger, admiration for her obvious expertise and resilience, anger at the waste of keeping such capabilities suppressed out of vindictive spite. How long since you've been able to work on systems at this level of complexity? 3 years, 2 months, and 18 days, Kira replied with the precision that had become habitual during her confinement. But it's like riding a transport, the knowledge was always there, just waiting for the opportunity to use it again. Their plan required her to communicate directly with the technology vendor while maintaining the illusion that she was working under Morlean's supervision. The challenge was conducting legitimate technical evaluation while documenting the process in ways that would trigger the contract clauses Samuel had embedded in their agreement. Remember, Samuel said as they prepared for her first vendor communication, you're not just evaluating technology. You're proving that you're a skilled professional whose expertise has been systematically wasted. And if Morlean becomes suspicious about the contract terms, then we rely on his greed being stronger than his caution. The potential profits from this deal are significant enough that he's likely to overlook details that seem routine. Kira's first day working as a legitimate consultant rather than an indentured servant revealed the extent to which her treatment had affected her confidence and self-perception. She approached technical problems with expertise that impressed the vendor's engineers, but she constantly sought Samuel's approval for decisions that should have been routine professional judgments. "Kira," Samuel said during one of their progress reviews, "you've just solved a system integration problem that stumped the vendor's technical team for weeks. You don't need my permission to be excellent at your job." "It's difficult to remember that I'm allowed to make independent decisions," she admitted. "For years, any initiative or independent thinking was punished. It's going to take time to trust my own judgment again." The psychological aspects of liberation proved as complex as the legal ones. Kira's technical abilities were intact, but her confidence in her right to use them had been systematically undermined by treatment designed to make her question her own worth. However, as the consulting project progressed and her evaluation work proved increasingly valuable, Kira began to rediscover not just her professional capabilities but her sense of personal dignity. The vendor's engineers treated her as a respected colleague whose insights improved their understanding of their own systems, a stark contrast to the dehumanizing treatment she had endured from Morlian. "Ms. Thane," said Chief Engineer Rodriguez during one of their technical conferences, "your analysis of the supply chain bottlenecks identified problems we didn't even realize we had. This system is going to perform far better than our original projections suggested." Samuel watched Kira's reaction to being addressed with professional respect, noting how her posture straightened and her voice gained confidence as she responded to technical questions with the authority her expertise warranted. "The key to optimization," Kira explained to Rodriguez, "is understanding that efficiency isn't just about speed, it's about reducing waste at every level of the process. When you eliminate redundancies and streamline information flow, the improvements cascade through the entire system." The success of her technical work created the documentation needed to trigger the contract clauses that would nullify her debt obligations. But more importantly, it was restoring her sense of professional identity and personal worth. Their plan reached its critical phase when Morlian received the preliminary evaluation report that would determine whether to proceed with the technology acquisition. Samuel had crafted the report format to highlight both the system's value and Kira's indispensable role in achieving the projected efficiency improvements. "Inspector Cross," Morlian said, reviewing the documentation with obvious satisfaction, "this evaluation suggests profit margins significantly higher than I initially projected. Ms. Thane's analysis has been quite thorough. She's demonstrated exactly the kind of technical expertise that makes complex acquisitions successful," Samuel agreed. "The vendor's engineers have been impressed by her insights. And the implementation timeline depends on maintaining continuity with the technical specialist who conducted the evaluation. System integration of this complexity requires ongoing involvement from someone who understands both the technology and your specific operational requirements." Samuel watched as Morlian processed the implications, seeing the moment when he realized that continuing to punish Kira for her defiance would cost him significant profits. "Inspector Cross, perhaps it's time to reconsider Ms. Thane's working arrangements. Her technical contributions suggest that her capabilities have been underutilized in her current assignment." "I think that would be wise," Samuel said, maintaining professional neutrality while celebrating internally. "Her expertise seems essential for maximizing the benefits of this acquisition." The contract amendments that Morlian signed to formalize Kira's expanded role contained the language Samuel had been waiting for: performance-based compensation that would automatically satisfy her debt obligations once the system implementation achieved its projected efficiency targets. Ms. Thane, Morlian said with the kind of forced courtesy that suggested he was swallowing his pride for financial reasons, "it appears that your technical skills are more valuable to this operation than I previously realized. We'll be adjusting your working conditions to reflect your contributions to this project." Kira's response was carefully professional, but Samuel could see the mixture of triumph and wariness in her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Morlian. I look forward to contributing to the project's success." As they left Morlian's office with signed agreements that would ensure Kira's freedom, Samuel felt the satisfaction of a plan executed successfully. But he also recognized that legal liberation was only the beginning of the more complex process of helping Kira rebuild a life after years of systematic dehumanization. "Samuel," she said quietly as they walked through the station's corridors, "I can't quite believe this is real. After so long, I'd started to think that being treated with dignity was something that happened to other people." "It's real," Samuel assured her. "And it's something you deserve not because you've earned it through exceptional performance, but because you're a person with inherent worth and dignity." Looking at Kira as she began to process the reality of her approaching freedom, Samuel realized that their success in outwitting Morlian was only the first step in a much longer journey toward full recovery and liberation. Kira's legal emancipation became official 43 days after Samuel had first discovered her eating from a bowl on the floor, when the logistics system implementation exceeded all projected performance targets and automatically triggered the debt cancellation clauses embedded in their consulting contract. But as they celebrated her freedom in Samuel's temporary quarters on Nexus Prime, both realized that liberation involved challenges neither had fully anticipated. "I keep expecting someone to tell me this is temporary," Kira said, looking at the legal documentation that officially ended her indenture to Morlian Enterprises. "For years, every small improvement in my conditions was eventually taken away as punishment for some perceived violation. This is permanent," Samuel assured her, though he was beginning to understand that psychological freedom would require more time and effort than legal freedom had. "Morlian has no further claim on your time, your work, or your life." Kira nodded, but her expression carried the wariness of someone who had learned that hope was dangerous when it could be crushed without warning. "What happens now?" "I have technical skills, but no recent work history that doesn't involve indentured servitude. No references except from the vendor engineers who worked with me on this project." Samuel had been considering exactly that question since their plan's success became inevitable. "What would you want to do if you could choose anything?" "I'd want to help other people in situations like mine," Kira said without hesitation. "There have to be thousands of workers throughout the Outer Rim territories trapped in contracts designed to exploit rather than employ them. And you'd want to use your technical expertise to help them?" "Technical expertise and lived experience. I understand how these systems work from the inside, how they maintain control, and where they might be vulnerable to challenge." Samuel felt a surge of excitement as he recognized the possibilities her insights represented. "Kira, what if I told you that my inspection authority could be significantly more effective with someone who understands exploitation from the victim's perspective?" Over the following weeks, they developed a partnership that combined Samuel's knowledge of legal systems with Kira's understanding of how those systems could be circumvented by those who profited from human misery. Working together, they began identifying patterns of abuse that individual inspections couldn't detect, networks of operations that moved workers between facilities to avoid oversight, financial manipulations that created artificial debt spirals, and contract structures that exploited regulatory loopholes. "Look at this," Kira said, analyzing employment records from multiple stations throughout the sector. "These three operations are using identical contract language and identical fee structures. That's not coincidence, it's coordination. A systematic network rather than isolated violations," Samuel agreed, reviewing the financial data she had compiled. "Which means we can treat it as organized criminal activity rather than just labor violations." Their investigation revealed that Morlian's operation was part of a much larger network that trafficked in what amounted to legalized slavery throughout the Outer Rim territories. The complexity of the conspiracy required approaches that went beyond traditional labor inspection methods. "We need evidence that demonstrates coordination between these operations," Samuel said. "Financial records, communication logs, anything that proves they're working together to circumvent worker protection laws." "I might be able to help with that," Kira said. Morlian kept detailed records of his operations, including communications with other facility operators. "If I could access those systems." "Legally," Samuel emphasized. "We can't use information obtained through unauthorized access." "Legally," Kira agreed. "But there are ways to encourage people to share information voluntarily, especially if they think it might benefit them." Their investigation strategy involved approaching other indentured workers throughout the network, using Kira's credibility as someone who had successfully escaped her situation to encourage them to share their experiences and documentation. The process was slow and required careful attention to worker safety, but it gradually built a comprehensive picture of systematic exploitation. The pattern is always the same, Kira explained as they compiled testimony from dozens of workers. Legitimate job offers that require transportation to remote locations, contracts that seem reasonable until hidden fees and compound interest make escape impossible, and punishment systems that break resistance through systematic dehumanization. And the legal structures that protect these operations? Complex corporate arrangements that make it difficult to determine who's actually responsible for violations, contracts written in technical language that obscures exploitative terms, and regulatory capture that ensures enforcement agencies focus on paperwork compliance rather than actual working conditions. Their evidence compilation took 4 months and resulted in a comprehensive report that demonstrated how current labor protection laws were being systematically circumvented throughout the Outer Rim territories. The report's recommendations included both specific prosecutions and broader regulatory reforms that would close the loopholes being exploited. "This is remarkable work," said Director Hassan of the Interstellar Labor Protection Agency, reviewing their findings. "The scope of this network and the sophistication of their legal evasion methods explain why individual inspections haven't been effective in addressing these problems. The key insight," Samuel said, "came from working with someone who understood the system from the inside." Kira's experience revealed patterns that wouldn't be apparent to external observers. "Ms. Thane, would you be interested in a permanent position with the agency? Your combination of technical expertise and field experience would be invaluable for developing more effective inspection and enforcement methods." Kira looked at Samuel, then back at Director Hassan. "I'd be honored to help, but I'd want to work with Inspector Cross. Our partnership has been effective because we approach these problems from complementary perspectives." The offer that emerged from their meeting exceeded both their expectations. Joint appointment as senior investigator specializing in systematic labor exploitation, with authority to coordinate multi-jurisdictional investigations and propose regulatory reforms based on their findings. "We'll be traveling throughout the Outer Rim territories," Samuel said as they reviewed their new assignment. "Investigating operations, documenting violations, and helping trapped workers find paths to freedom. And we'll be doing it as equals," Kira added, "partners in both professional work and personal commitment to justice." 6 months later, they stood together in what had once been Morlean's facility on Nexus Prime, now converted into a training center for former indentured workers learning technical skills that would ensure their economic independence. The transformation felt symbolic of everything their partnership had achieved. "Do you remember what you asked me the first day we met?" Kira said, looking at the training facility where 24 former servants were learning engineering and logistics systems. "I asked if you were all right," Samuel replied. "And now?" Samuel looked at Kira, seeing not the broken woman he had found eating from a bowl on the floor, but a confident professional whose insights were helping transform labor protection enforcement throughout the galaxy. Their partnership had evolved beyond their initial rescue and recovery dynamic into something built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection. "Now I think you're exactly who you were always meant to be," he said. "And I think we make a pretty good team." "The best kind of team," Kira agreed. "One built on the foundation of recognizing each other's worth and dignity." As they watched former indentured workers mastering skills that would ensure their independence, Samuel reflected on how much had changed since his routine inspection of Nexus Prime had revealed conditions that violated every principle of sentient rights. Their success in liberating Kira had led to systematic reforms that protected thousands of workers throughout the Outer Rim territories. But more than that, it had demonstrated the power of treating people with dignity and recognizing their potential rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. The woman who had once been forced to eat from the ground like an animal had become a leader in the fight for worker liberation, proving that freedom was not just about escaping oppression but about having the opportunity to become everything you were capable of being. Their partnership, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to justice, had become a model for the kind of cooperation that made real change possible. And every worker they helped liberate became proof that recognizing human dignity was not just morally right, but practically transformative for everyone involved.